So you know how you sent over that article by Larken Rose?
Yeah.
Nobody believed me.
That's the point. It's an interesting title, right? Makes you think a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. You get the sense that there's something going on beneath the surface.
Yeah.
And Rose really wants us to dig into that, right? So our deep dive today is into his critique of blind obedience to authority, to the government. We're going to examine his arguments and also get into some of the reactions that he's encountered to his ideas, because they're genuinely kind of surprising.
Yeah. And we're going beyond just summarizing him, right? We want to look at how he uses satire and what he has to say about why people believe what they do politically. It all seems to center on this tension between your own conscience and what authority figures tell you to do.
Yeah.
So Rose starts his article, if I remember right, talking about something he wrote earlier. He argued that we should just blindly obey the government. What was the point of that, do you think? I think it's really interesting to think about his approach there. He was trying to use it like a Trojan horse, right? He lays out this argument for obeying all the laws, paying all your taxes, basically setting aside any personal qualms you have in favor of what the government says. And importantly, he does it without any winking or nudging, you know? There's no, like, disclaimer at the bottom saying, hey, just kidding.
Yeah, but the funny thing is that nobody believed him. Not even people who normally like the idea of a strong government. That's a really strange reaction, don't you think?
Yeah, and that's really where his main argument starts to come out. It makes you think that even people who are, on the face of it, all for the government having power, even they're uncomfortable with total obedience, if you put it to them that directly. I think as humans, we just don't like the idea of giving up our own judgment entirely.
Right. And he uses that phrase, you can't pick and choose which laws to obey, which everyone says. It sounds reasonable when you just hear it. But then he brings up these awful things from history, like slavery being legal. That changes how the phrase feels, right?
Definitely. When you think about having to obey every law without question, even laws that we all know were evil, it shows that the whole idea has some serious problems.
Right. It makes me realize how often we just take these common sayings about authority at face value. We're supposed to respect the law, but we don't stop and ask why or whether there are times we shouldn't.
Yeah, and Rose says that this comes from an internalized belief, the idea that we must follow the law just because it is the law. He really goes after that idea.
He calls it intellectually lazy and morally bankrupt, right? What makes him say that?
His reasoning is that if you just do what the law says without thinking about whether it's right or wrong, you're not really taking responsibility for your actions. If you do something you think is bad just because the government tells you to, you've basically given up on making moral decisions. Rose thinks that's a really serious mistake. He sees it as a failure to think ethically.
Yeah, it makes you wonder where the line is between respecting authority and following your conscience.
Yeah, where do you draw that line as an individual?
It's hard to figure out. And Rose points out that people on both sides of the political spectrum are kind of inconsistent with this, right? Conservatives and liberals both seem to pick and choose which laws they think are important, and it's not always based on a clear set of principles.
That's an interesting point. He gives some examples. Conservatives might be all for really strict immigration laws, but against gun control. And, on the other hand, liberals might say the government should stay out of your personal life, but also want the government to regulate things like what people say and what businesses do. Rose says this shows that our political ideologies are often more about feelings and group loyalty than about a well-thought-out philosophy.
So it's less about truly believing in smaller government or bigger government, and more about which policies fit with what they already want.
That's what Rose says. It leads to this thought experiment he does, which I think is really clever. He imagines himself someone who's always argued for voluntarism, you know, the idea that everything should be voluntary, no coercion, especially from the government. He imagines himself suddenly saying that there are times when the state using violence is okay.
Right, and he's hoping that his followers would call him out, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, hold on, that's not what you've been saying all along. The point wasn't whether state violence could ever be justified, but whether people would just follow him blindly or whether they would actually think about the principles he's always talking about. He wants people to be guided by reason and by consistent moral frameworks, not just by individuals, no matter how much they like that person.
That really shows how important it is to think for yourself, doesn't it? And he makes the same point about politicians, too, doesn't he? He talks about Trump, RFK, and Tulsi Gabbard. What does he say about them?
Yeah, Rose is really skeptical of politicians who sometimes say things that sound anti-establishment, like they're for individual freedom, but then do things that are very authoritarian. He says it shows that they don't really believe in those principles. It's just talk to get people to vote for them. They're telling people what they want to hear to gain power, but their actions don't match up.
And he thinks people fall for this because they don't know how to think critically,
Hmm.
right? They just like the person and what they're saying without really analyzing it.
Right. And he uses that analogy about the calculus professor, remember? It's a good one, isn't it?
Yeah, the one where you're learning calculus from this professor and then you find out they're a horrible person. I think he even said a serial killer to make the point really strongly. But that doesn't make the calculus wrong, does it?
Right. The point is that whether an idea is true or not has nothing to do with the person who's saying it. We should be judging the ideas themselves, not just being swayed by the speaker.
So it all comes back to not blindly following people. Don't just vote for a savior, as Rose puts it. Figure out what the principles are, and then judge everything based on those principles, politicians, laws, even your own beliefs.
Exactly. Develop your own moral compass, your own way of figuring these things out, and don't rely on others to tell you what to believe.
Rose also talks about the psychology behind why people might be attracted to authoritarianism. It's not always just logic, is it?
Right, he talks about emotional manipulation. He says that people often support authoritarian figures or systems because they're scared or because they've been promised security or because they're responding to emotional appeals, not because they've actually thought about the issue carefully.
So the message is, don't just go along with things. Don't blindly follow authority without thinking about whether it's moral or logical. And it's interesting, isn't it, how people who usually like the idea of government recoiled from Rose's idea of total obedience. It shows, I think, that we all kind of know deep down that individual judgment is important.
Yeah, it's like there's this inherent tension in how we think about politics. We want to have leaders and rules, but we also don't want to completely give up our own ability to decide what's right and wrong.
It's something to think about. It makes me wonder, think about a time when you might have just followed someone in authority or a rule without really stopping to think about the principles behind it. What happened? How might things have been different if you'd thought about it in terms of principles? It's a question worth asking ourselves, I think.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
My pleasure.